Whitley Strieber. A few years ago, to be exact, on February the 4th, 2005, I had a remarkable guest on Dreamland, Frank Ficino. Frank was the author of the Braxton County case. I think the book was called The Flatwoods Monster, and it had to have been one of the most extraordinary shows we ever did about UFOs. The book was phenomenally well researched, and I am very happy to say that Frank is back with us with one of the very finest UFO books I have ever read. The research in this book is remarkably skillful and thorough. The book has a foreword by Stanton Friedman and an afterword by Stanton Friedman, and I will be talking to Stanton Friedman in the subscriber section, where we're going to go and look at an even larger canvas from 1947 to 1954. And for those of you who are subscribers, do not miss that, because it's going to be phenomenal. What's also going to be phenomenal right now is talking to Frank Ficino about his new book, Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952. And let me tell you, hold on to your hats, because what you have not been told about what happened in this country and in this world in 1952 is phenomenal. Just phenomenal. Welcome to the show, Frank Ficino.
Thanks for having me on, Whitley.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Now, Frank, let's go back a little bit to this era of the early 50s. And why don't you begin by telling us what drew you to research this era in the first place?
Well, Whitley, back in the early 90s, I was visiting some relatives in West Virginia in Braxton County, and I stumbled across this Flatwoods monster case. I was going into this little town called Flatwoods, and it said on the side of the road on this big wooden sign, "Welcome to Flatwoods, home of the Green Monster." And I didn't have any previous UFO involvement. I had known, a little bit about it from what was in magazines and the press, but I looked into this case. I was on the fence, down the middle. I didn't know what to make of it, so I started researching it on my own time. And what intrigued me about the case is when I started speaking to the people in Flatwoods, it was more interesting seeing the response about this Flatwoods monster from this local citizens than the actual case itself. The town was very scared. Not too many people talked about this particular case. And as I'm now in my 17th year of research with this Flatwoods case and the Shoot Them Down book that just came out recently. And the Flatwoods case was very interesting because when it happened back on September 12th in 52, the public was told pretty much overnight what had occurred. It was this 12-foot-tall creature that landed in a damaged aircraft in central West Virginia. Which
people initially mistook for a giant owl.
Right. Well, that was the government's official explanation.
It was a 6-foot-tall owl.
Yeah, a giant owl, which is, that's what it's basically.
The giant owl. In many ways, that's as interesting as if it had been an alien.
Right. So I started researching the Flatwoods incident. Then I started doing an overall look into what was going on during the summer of 1952.
And you have, in your career, have produced some of the best UFO research ever done. I mean, you're right up there. You and Richard Dolan are neck and neck, in my opinion.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, what I found out, Whitley, is during 1952 was the record year for UFO reports sent to Project Blue Book. And there was 1,501 reports sent to Blue Book, and actually 303 were unknowns. So the summer of 52, which the Shoot Them Down book encompasses, June, July, August, and September of that year, there was 1,134 reports sent to Blue Book.
Right. And at this time, Blue Book did not turn into what it later became. It was still just a fact-gathering and maybe something more effort by the Air Force.
Right, and Edward Ruppelt, Captain Ruppelt, was in charge of Blue Book at that time. And also that year we have the Washington sightings, June, July, and then into August.
And
June and July.
We'll get into those later.
Right, so there was a lot going on that year.
So tell us a little bit about Captain Ruppelt and his operation as it existed at the time. It was, of course, headquartered at Wright-Patterson, as we would expect it to be.
Right.
What was it under? Where was he in the bureaucracy of the area?
Well, he was the head of the ATIC at Wright-Pat. He headed up the department for
What
Project
does ATIC mean?
Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And Ruppelt actually, in his book, the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, he actually stated that in early June of '52, the Air Force was unknowingly in the initial stages of a flap, the flying saucer flap,
which is a very specific term, as I recall from reading your book.
Right.
What they mean by a flap.
A flap is actually, I'm going to give you a quote, Whitley, for the record. This is an Air Force explanation right out of their dictionary. A flap is a condition, a situation, or a state of being of a group of persons characterized by an advanced degree of confusion that has not quite reached panic proportions. So the country was at the boiling point back then, and during the summer of '52, with the frenzy of saucer sightings that was going on.
Which means that they were. They were considering this quite seriously then.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
This is, you have to remember too, back in this era, Whitley, intelligence had figured out that the Russians had the capability of dropping atomic bombs on this country. So the Air Force was spring-loaded. They were ready to go, and they were chasing anything and everything that was seen in the skies or picked up on radar.
Now, what kind of orders were they under in 1952? And I'm referring, of course, to this International News Service story. Right.
It was released back in July.
July 29th.
July 29th. The INS report that fighter interceptor planes of the United States had been placed on a 24-hour nationwide alert against flying saucers. And an Air Force Public Information Officer, Mansell Monty, had stated, and I'm going to give a quote here for the record, the jet pilots are and have been under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down.
Which is the shadow of the reality of that is all that's left. But what Frank has done is he's filled out that shadow with his research, and now we know we have a remarkable and powerful picture of what happened back in those days. Now, let's talk a little bit now about this telegram from Robert Farnsworth, President of the U.S. Rocket Society, to President Truman, who was then President of the United States, if I'm not correct, in 1952.
Correct.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Farnsworth was actually dead against this whole quote of information about shooting down flying saucers, and he actually had sent a letter to Harry Truman and all the heads of the armed forces, and he says this could be of the gravest consequences if we were to shoot down something of superior intelligence.
Well, yeah, you would think so.
Right.
You don't want to make the guy with the better bazooka mad.
Right. But what we have, I did a little bit of research, Whitley. Now, I want to explain, I didn't do this whole project on myself. I'm an illustrator and author, but I had a heck of a team behind me. I worked with Korean War vets, World War II vets, Vietnam vets, fighter pilots, mechanics. So I have a team behind me that I worked with to better understand the military end. It's not just UFOs. I had to study the military aspect of what was going on, and that's what I think was lacking in the UFO field for so many years. Everybody was looking at the flying saucers over here, but nobody was looking at the Air Force, Navy, and Marine fighter jets of what was going on the other side.
Right.
And what I got a lot of information about the fighter jets in 1952 and the capability they had with their armaments.
Right.
And
which was pretty substantial. I mean, these were not toys.
Right. The Air Force had the F-94C Starfire, and that was introduced in July of 52. And they also had the F-86D Sabre Dog, that was the nickname. And the Navy had the F-7U-3 Cutlass, Whitley. Now, what made these jets all different from the rest of the jets in the Armed Forces hangars was they were all armed with rockets.
Right. And they
what they had was folding fin aerial rockets, and they were 2.75-inch rockets, and they had 7.5-pound warheads. And they actually traveled 2,500 feet per second. And the Starfire actually had an onboard computer, Whitley, that was coupled with the radar that was set within the dome of the jet. So the pilot and radar operator in a Starfire could actually just sit back, hit the computer, and let the computer take over, and the jet would actually fly after the target and pick the precise moment to fire. Now, this is what they were using during this era when they were chasing these saucers.
It was the first really electronically sophisticated aircraft that we had.
Right.
And at that time was literally light years beyond what had come before.
Right, and the public wasn't made aware of what we had back then too much. From what I researched and looking at newspapers and articles and military books, the public was kept kind of low on what was going on. And
the public was not aware of a lot of other things. We're talking to Frank Ficino, the author of Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952, which ranks as one of the finest jobs of UFO research ever done. We'll be right back. We're talking to Frank Ficino. He is the author of Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952. You can get it from the unknowncountry.com store, and you certainly should, because this is really an excellent, excellent piece of work. It will open your eyes. And for those of us who are deeply involved in this whole UFO phenomenon, either as participants like us abductees or as interested parties like many of those of you who have not been abductees or have never seen anything, this is one of those books that gives you the kind of foundation into reality that you need so badly. This is what history hasn't reported, but what is true. And Frank, what I'd like to get to now is the question of the number of crashes of jets in 1952 in the United States. And it's a remarkable story, right? At that time, we were also involved in the Korean War. But tell us a little bit about the number of fighters that went down in this country.
Well, I started doing some research with Stanton Friedman, and we were some of the first to actually review the recently declassified Air Force accident reports. They were from Norton Air Force Base. They were in charge of the flight and safety research. And there was an overwhelming number of fighter jet accidents and deaths. It was mind-boggling, Whitley. I had to kind of change gears to look into another area because it would have taken me 10 lifetimes to go through all these documents. I studied the major cases during the summer of 52 and reported them in the book. But what I did an individual case study, and I used the New York Times as my basis.
Which in those days was reporting this legitimately, which I don't think it really does so much anymore. Most newspapers don't.
Right. Now, what I did, Whitley, is I went from 1951 to 1956. This was the era of the shoot 'em down, orders that were given. And I actually found 204 aircraft accident incidents where the jets were destroyed. This did not include mid-air collisions, planes that landed and a wheel fell off. These are major accidents where, life was lost and the aircraft were completely destroyed. Fighter jet interceptors only, Whitley. Okay, now out of those 204 cases that I found in the New York Times, there was 229 fighter aircraft destroyed because several of these cases had these crazy stories where between 2, 3, and 4 jets all went down at the same time for unknown reasons. And out of the 204 incidents of these accidents, 192 were actually destroyed over the United States of America, which is mind-boggling.
It's worth asking that during the Korean War conflict, how many were destroyed over Korea?
I have some of the listings in my book of that.
It's 83. It's in your book.
Yeah, it was 83.
Listen to that, folks. I mean, here we're looking at during a war, in a war zone where they were actually under attack by MiGs every time they took off, we lose 83 planes.
Mm-hmm.
We lose twice as many here at home.
Now, what's interesting, Whitley, is that of these cases in the New York Times that were reported, there were 20 fighter combat veterans that died over the United States. And there was actually, the Times reported 4 of them were aces. And
so these were not exactly inexperienced pilots.
You're right. Let me just give you the top 5 guys right here that I have in front of me. Captain Gentile, he had 182 combat missions, World War II. Colonel Council, World War II veteran, 130 combat missions. Captain Gay, he was a Korean fighter jet pilot, 105 combat missions.
And then they come home and they die in the peaceful skies of the continental United States.
Right. 2 more guys, Captain Wagner and Lieutenant Burke, 100 combat missions each. Burke was in the Korean War. He was fighting MiGs. These guys all come back stateside, and they all died. And actually, 2 of them vanished off the face of the earth.
Vanished?
Yeah, and actually, out of all of these cases that I researched, Whitley, this is between 51 and 56, the New York Times, 19 pilots vanished over the United States, which...
Vanished.
Right, and...
that is
overall,
so chilling and so eerie.
Yeah, worldwide there was 26.
American pilots?
American fighter jets vanished. And when I did a breakdown, that is 35 airmen vanished over America, and the balance, there was actually 42 worldwide.
Now, you actually tracked down the grave of... Tell us about that, will you?
On September 12, 52 was probably what was the biggest UFO flap in world history. I have documented 21 hours of UFO sightings over the United States. And that was the night of the Flatwoods Monster incident. This was like the banner day for sightings.
Right.
And I spent about 14 years investigating a case that happened right within the timeline of the Flatwoods Monster event. And it was an F-94 Starfire jet off the coast of Florida vanished into thin air. And before the documents actually came out, Whitley, I had contacted the Air Force, several different government agencies, and there was no record of the pilot, Jones, or Del Curto, the co-pilot. There was nothing about these guys. They were never born. They never died. They were never in the Air Force. Not a damn word about these guys. Then when the accident reports came out from Norton Air Force Base, when they were released, Stanton Friedman got them for me, and we reviewed the case. And the case was actually about 70 pages long, and it took me about 2 years to go through this, working with my military people. And we did a complete reenactment from the second that jet took off until it disappeared. I even had a pilot who sat in the seat in front of me, and I sat and played the role of the radar operator in the back, and we recreated this whole scenario. Whitley, it is a crying shame what they said happened. The explanations were absolutely absurd of what the official report said. And also on September 12, 52, I might add that the case before the Jones and Del Curto and the case after were yanked and sent to higher classification. A lot of coincidences, missing information.
So they tried to make them non-people, but you found.
Right, and I spoke to the surviving brothers of the pilot and the radar operator, and they were in left field. They were boggled with the whole explanation that was given to them, and one of the brothers actually started crying to me on the phone when I was speaking to him, and he said it was just opening up a whole wound all over again by talking to me about this, because we were talking about the inconsistencies in the Air Force reports. And I actually have the copies of the original letter sent from General Benjamin Chidlaw, who was the head of the Air Defense Command at the time, who had actually sent out the initial telegram to the brothers.
And what does it say?
It just talks about how the plane disappeared, and the bottom line to the whole Air Force case, they blamed it on pilot error. Yet the jet was being tracked by 5 radar stations, and in voice communication, Whitley, it just disappeared like that.
It literally disappeared. And this reminds me of a remarkable couple of cases that occurred later. One over Australia and one over Puerto Rico, and we have not very little of the Australian case, where a young man was flying to Tasmania and his plane disappeared in the context of there being a large UFO in the area. And he was himself very interested in UFOs, and it was quite a big case for a while. Then the Puerto Rican case, there's actually a frantic call to the air traffic controllers, which you can listen to, by the way, in an audio-enhanced version on the unknowncountry.com subscriber section, where you can hear the pilot frantically saying that there's a huge UFO outside his plane, and nothing was ever found of that plane either.
Well, there was no wreckage found, and there was a massive search to the whole Gulf of Mexico.
Nothing found, and yet he was on 5 radars when he disappeared.
Exactly, and he was a voice communication.
Was he? Do you know what the voice communication said?
No, because the documents are edited very heavily, Whitley.
So it's all classified.
Right, and just edited, cut up, so I was only reading part of the report. And what's interesting is out of all of these pages that I spent a couple of years researching, there is not one word about the interaction with the radar operator.
Not one word.
More suspicion. Not one word of this guy's interaction.
Have you tried to get in touch with the radar operator? Any way to find out who it was?
I know who it was, but the reports do not bring his name up, which is very odd, because he was the guy in charge of he was the radar operator on board. And it's kind of funny.
On board the aircraft.
Right. And
no, I meant the people on the ground who were talking to them. Some of those personnel may still be alive.
They may be. I've been unable to get hold of them.
I see.
But I write a whole page up, Whitley, where in the book, where what I did is I went through all these documents and I pulled out the quotes from all the individuals who were in the tower at Tyndall Air Force Base. And when they were brought up before the accident report, the aircraft accident board, it was like a 3-ring circus. And if you remember in that section of the book, Whitley,
right.
Reading it, everybody from the captain and who was in control of the tower all the way down, every personnel that was involved in this case, when they were asked questions, there's about 40 answers where they say, I don't know, I don't remember, about this time, could have been this time, maybe, I don't remember. And that's what this whole thing is about. Nobody knew what was going on, supposedly. But they blamed everything on pilot error. And it was like everybody in the control tower gave all of these lame excuses. This was a fighter jet. And especially, this is kind of scary because if guys in the control tower didn't know what the heck was going on.
Yes.
We're supposed to be protecting this country from Russians bringing atomic bombs in.
Yeah.
The jet just vanishes off radar in thin air with no explanation. They haven't been found to this day.
Well, Frank, we're going to be right back after these messages. This is Whitley Strieber. We're talking to Frank Ficino about the reality of what was going on in the United States in the early 50s when we were attempting to shoot down UFOs that we could not talk down, which was to say, I suppose, all of them, because maybe we did talk some of them down. I don't know. What do you think about that, Frank? Is there any chance we did make some kind of contact?
Well, what I put together, Whitley, on the September 12th incident of the UFO flap that lasted for 21 hours, the Flatwoods monster case fell right into the middle of this. And I was actually able to trace 4 damaged UFOs that penetrated American airspace and flew across the United States, and one of them was actually the Flatwoods monster craft that landed in central West Virginia.
You know, why don't we stop right here, because we've mentioned this a number of times. Why don't you give us an outline of exactly what that was? And you subscribers who would like to listen to a very detailed interview about this incredibly fascinating and remarkable case, go to the to Dreamland, go to the Dreamland archive and scroll down to February of 2005, and you can listen to that whole show, and it is very well worth listening to. But what exactly was the Flatwoods monster, Frank?
What I did, Whitley, first of all, is I put this giant map together, and approximately 6 by 8 feet, and it was aeronautical maps, and I pieced them all together. And I spent several years researching Project Blue Book. Then I went to local, regional, different newspapers. Blue Book actually was the key, believe it or not, to the whole Flatwoods case, because there are tons of reports in there of what happened that night. Nobody had ever taken the time to go through these documents. It took me years to research them, and they were in bad shape. I, being an illustrator and trained in calligraphy and different art fields, I was able to go in, Whitley, and actually go back over and re-ink all these documents. And that took 5 years to do about 180 pages. Now I have all of these pages, and I had to go into my map, and I pinpointed all the areas where they were seen. I worked with a couple military people, and we stood in front of the map, and we started connecting the dots. And just like a kid's book where you connect the dots, you start seeing the picture. And I started seeing the picture, and 3 damaged UFOs came in over the eastern seaboard. And one of them contained the Flatwoods monster, and it's actually documented in the New York Times, Whitley. It was called the Flame over Washington. It passed over the eastern seaboard, flew over Washington, D.C., and what is interesting is certain parts of its flight path trajectory, as it was heading west over Washington, it was at treetop level. Pieces were falling off of it. It was exploding. It flew across Virginia, went into West Virginia, flew into northern Braxton County, and made a 45-degree angle turn and followed the road through the mountains. If anybody's ever been in West Virginia, very mountainous and treacherous for flying. So what this thing did is when it hit the high point of Braxton County, it did what so many pilots will do during the war. You follow the railroad tracks, or you follow the road so you don't hit any obstructions like mountains or trees or rocks or cliffs. And it came down, flew into the center part of the state, and landed in Flatwoods. Now, if you look at a map, Whitley, you're going to see that Flatwoods is directly 206 miles west of Washington, D.C. So basically it was connecting the dots across the country, and that's how I was able to establish its flight path. Now, when this thing landed, it was seen by a bunch of kids playing football on the elementary school playground. They went to the house of Kathleen May and a cousin, Jean Lemon, who was 18 years old. They went up onto the farm to see what had landed up there. And this object actually landed at the high point of the property on the Bailey Fisher farm. En route to the group going up there, the thing had actually relocated and came into the lower part of a gully to get off the mountain where it couldn't be seen as readily, and it sat down in the gully of the farm. On the way up there, a gas was filtered through the area and engulfed the whole section of the farm where the group was walking up, and they encountered what was nicknamed the Flatwoods Monster. It wasn't a monster at all, Whitley. It was a 12-foot-tall mechanical device that looked like a small space probe. And the myth was formed when Kathleen May, Jean Lemon, the 18-year-old, and a local reporter went on television on We the People the following week. And a sketch artist sat down with the two witnesses, and he drew up this picture of a monster wearing a hood with a garment with a lower torso, looked like a dress.
Yeah, so in other words, but it was not actually a living creature. What you're saying is it was some kind of a probe or a device.
Right, and it was Freddie May, who I work close with, and his mom, Kathleen May, told me this thing looked like a spacesuit and like something was inside of it, because it had this, what was portrayed as a big pointed hood in the shape of an ace of spades over the top of the head was actually an outer helmet, or like a cockpit. If you look into a fighter jet's cockpit, you see the pilot sitting there with a helmet. The cockpit was actually the ace of spades, Whitley. The inside was actually, with what was said to be a head, was actually an inner helmet, and the witnesses said that there were two gigantic eyes, but they were portholes. And what the press did is just run with this story and go crazy with it.
So something was inside it, in all probability.
Right, something was actually inside of it.
You know,
and
Frank, no, go ahead.
What I actually discovered, I worked with Ailey Stewart. It took me years to track him down. He was the reporter who was the Johnny on the spot. He went up there right afterwards. And he actually knelt down to the ground, and he smelt where the gases had settled. And he actually worked with the Charleston Gazette, at the capital city of West Virginia. And on Monday morning, September 15th, 3 days after, there was a special report article, and it actually stated that it, quote, looked like a mechanical man, was about 10 feet tall, 4 foot wide, okay, sported a black spade-like cowl which extended a foot or more above its head, okay, and then you have that following Friday, it was portrayed as being a monster wearing a cloth garment, but the fact is, it was actually reported 3 days after the incident as looking like a mechanical man and being metallic.
Yes.
So Frank, there is our proof right there.
So what I want to sort of step back a little bit.
Okay.
And in 1947, we had a number of UFO encounters, the early ones. Mm-hmm. There had been some before then, certainly, but nothing on the order of what happened in that year, to the extent that there were extensively analyzed and looked into, and we had, of course, the Roswell incident, the possible crash on the plains of San Augustine. Then between that year and the early 50s, there's a kind of a continuous undertone of UFO activity. Things are being reported fairly consistently. There's the green fireball phenomenon that emerges in New Mexico. And then suddenly, in 1952, it begins in early July with, interestingly enough, one of the earliest pieces of UFO film. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Which piece are we talking about?
Okay, now I am...
the Tremetan.
We're catching each other short, Frank.
Yeah.
I have a bad habit of doing that, and I will find it in your book in just a moment. See, he's written such a huge book here, folks. Even he doesn't remember everything that's in it. Okay, this is the Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Let's see. I'm just reading. It's the Tremonton, Utah.
Right.
Okay, now you know what I'm talking about. Why don't you describe this? This is remarkable. Warrant Officer Delbert C. Newhouse took 40 feet of film, and the debunkers are always saying, oh, these videos and stuff are never taken by professionals. Tell us a little bit about this man and what he did.
Well, he took all this footage that wasn't taken seriously at first.
Right, but he was a graduate of the Naval Photographic School. He'd been in the Navy for 19 years. He was a 1,000 hours of aerial photography missions, 2,200 hours as a chief photographer. He was a highly skilled professional aerial photographer, in fact.
Right, and it was actually with 16 millimeter camera. He had taken it out of his trunk and he shot this. And it wasn't taken seriously at first, and then it was, and the Air Force, they based a lot of their information, and they showed this film, and it was analyzed, and when it hit the press, they said it was grainy and this, that, and the other. But in reality, it was taken very seriously. And the Robertson panel actually reviewed the film. And it was Dr. Alvarez, who was a physicist.
Who reviewed it.
Right. And then all of a sudden they said it might be birds, specifically seagulls.
You're right.
So, it was written off, but, Navy warrant officer, who took this killer footage.
Yeah. He was a Navy warrant officer, a highly skilled professional, and it was written off because it was in the public domain, I would guess.
Right.
And because it would have been proof, and that they did not want to admit.
Right.
Now,
yes,
Frank,
they tried everything to identify these objects, but they failed. But then when the Robertson panel reviewed it, Alvarez, the physicist, he was actually the winner of the Nobel Prize. He said they might be birds, so it's like, here we go again.
they fired a cannon of authority at this in order to perpetuate a lie. One of the techniques that was used, and it has been used and is used constantly. Authority speaks, and when it lies, everybody still believes. We'll be right back. We're back talking to Frank Ficino, the author of Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952. His website is www.flatwoodsmonster.com. You can find out everything about what Frank is doing on his website. And before we came onto the air, Frank mentioned to me that he was working on a new book. Naturally, that pricked up my ears and my interest highly. Frank, can you tell us what you are working on right now? I'm fascinated.
Yeah, what I'm working on right now is my latest book, and it's called The Flatwoods Monster: From Myth to Reality. And it's not just about the Flatwoods Monster. It's about the September 12th flap that occurred that day, and the monster was right in the hub in the middle of this. And it's my 17-year investigation into all of these events. And
right.
What I did, Whitley, it's not just my investigation. I went back into the history books, libraries, museums. I have probably everything on the face of the earth about the Flatwoods Monster,
yes,
including all the original investigators' work. And I actually found one of the first guys who was up at the site, and I put the whole book together. It's got about 130 pictures in it. My first book was edited very heavily, and a lot of people were disappointed with, that aspect of the book because I lost control of it. And this
right.
book, I have total control of it.
And that's very important in this field because publishers will interfere, and in ways that don't help these books. You have to be, I know that when I published Confirmation, I had a constant, unending battle to be sure they did not drop things that were critically important in the book. And they did some, of course, and I see you had the same problem.
Yeah, and this book here is the definitive case study of the Flatwoods incident and the UFO flap that occurred that day.
Now, what I want to talk about now is this. We have a picture here, as I was starting to say before, from 1947 up into the mid-50s.
Right.
And it is a picture of someone showing up here and the United States reacting by basically trying to shoot at them. And there are indeed records of crashed and damaged discs and many more of crashed and damaged planes and disappearing pilots and dead pilots, etc., and so forth. This looks to me like somebody came here and they really did not know what they were doing, or they were not able to communicate with us in a way that was meaningful to those of us who are charged with defending our airspace, our country's airspace, or our world's airspace. There was a failure of communication. And this led me to think that perhaps what was happening was we've always sort of assumed, well, these must be aliens and they must be really skilled at this. They've probably done this many times before. But what if that's not true? What if this is the first place with an intelligent species they've ever found? And that would explain maybe the fumbling feeling this all has. Like, they don't communicate. They do keep returning to harm's way again and again. We do keep shooting to kill. Nothing works right. There's no communication. Nobody understands what's going on.
Right, which is kind of the whole thing is absurd. If you can't talk them down, shoot them down. That's basically shoot first and ask questions later, because what's the chances that an extraterrestrial race would speak English or a fighter pilot would understand an alien language? It's kind of absurd.
Right.
So in other words, Whitley, you shoot first and ask questions later. And I think that's when it peaked, is the night of the Flatwoods Monster incident on September 12th, why it was covered up so heavily. We have 4 damaged objects that went down in the United States.
Right.
And you see what gets out of them. I actually interviewed Colonel Dale Levitt, United States Army. He was the head of National Guard on that night, and he received a call from Washington, D.C., and he went up into Flatwoods with 50 to 60 troops, and I interviewed him, and he told me everything on a video camera, Whitley, and he explained what happened and how he went up there with his troops. There was actually another crash of another object in that area, and he was told to go to that area. Now, why would the Air Force send out 180 troops into Braxton County to look for what was said to have been a meteorite that landed? You don't send troops out like that. In Flatwoods, Whitley, they cordoned off the area. Colonel Levitt told me they took samples. There was pieces of metal, a black plastic-like material found strewn throughout the farm, and oil, some type of a strange oil. And he had to gather all this stuff up, and he shipped it back off to Washington.
Well, of course, that these things are often reported to have very, very high-speed rotating parts.
Right.
That might explain the oil and the bits of, because it's something that's rotating at ultra-high speed is damaged. It might very quickly become inoperable, thus causing the thing to come down.
They were crashing all over the place, Whitley.
So we were getting to them.
Right, yeah. One crashed in Tennessee, and a couple other ones crashed in West Virginia.
Jackie Gleason, the performer, used to tell a story, which was repeated to me by his wife, that he had been taken to a facility in Florida and shown some crashed UFOs that were still partly and in some cases virtually intact by President Nixon. And I have no reason to think that Jackie Gleason was lying, and certainly his wife wasn't. She was accurately describing what he had said, and this is a matter of public record now. If you I'm sure if you Google Jackie Gleason UFO, you'll find the whole story. But it's as if, we did gather these things up, and in those days, presidents were fully informed of this. And Eisenhower was certainly informed. Truman was informed. I know he was, because General Arthur Exon told me that everyone from Truman on down knew the Roswell crash object was not of this world within 24 hours of it being found. He told me that personally, and he was not lying either. So what you're saying is basically we shot a lot of them down.
Right. 4 of them went down on September 12th, and that's just one particular night.
Using weapons that are far less sophisticated than what we have now.
Right. But the one thing, Whitley, that the Air Force and an Army, Navy, Marine pilots that I spoke to, the one thing about these Mighty Mouse rockets is when they were launched, Whitley, they would have a pattern that could go out like holding 24 bottle rockets in a Coke bottle and blasting them off. The rockets didn't even know where they were going to go. So that's kind of tough to avoid. They were not heat-seeking. They were air-to-air.
So they were so low-tech, in other words, that they were dangerous to someone who was perhaps far more sophisticated than that.
You couldn't avoid them because the rockets didn't even know where they were going. If the wind caught them, boom, they would turn in a different direction. So picture hundreds of these things flying through the air, Whitley, at a UFO.
Frank, we're coming, if you can believe it, and I'm sure, Frank, you're going to be as surprised as I am when I say that we have nearly come to the end of this program. I have been totally enthralled by what you've been saying. And Frank's book, Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952, it's not his only book. Frank is also got a website. It is the flatwoodsmonster.com. That's flatwoodsmonster.com. Don't miss any of this because we're talking right now to one of the finest researchers in this field. And I'm going to be talking, by the way, to another one who provided a forward and an afterword for this book, and for a reason. Stanton Friedman is extremely discriminating, and this is a fabulous piece of work, as you can hear from the remarkable, incredible things he's telling us. Wow. But anyway, I'm going to be talking to Stanton in the subscriber section, and we're going to take a wider view of just what was happening, and I'm going to ask Stanton some questions about the possible Eisenhower meeting with aliens at Muroc Field. So subscribers, do not miss that. And do not miss Frank's earlier interview from February of 2005, still available in the subscriber archives. Frank, we've got just a couple minutes left. Why don't you kind of give us a summary here of what you think? We went to war with UFOs.
Right.
Where are we with this now? What's happening now?
I hope we learned our lesson from back then about shooting at these advanced UFOs, but it also seems like we took them down too, Whitley.
Yeah.
You know, we were able to take them down, and it's not that far-fetched when you consider the technology we had back then. We just didn't have bullets. One thing that really struck home with me is Stanton Friedman was in Washington Archives a couple of years back, and he actually went into some of the fighter accident reports, and he pulled some documents out for me, which I was very grateful for, because Stanton was in there digging around on his hands and knees all day, and he pulled out some mind-boggling stats, Whitley, which I'm going to throw at you right now. These are fighter major accidents that were recorded by the Air Force, and this was September 10th, 1952, memorandum, Lieutenant Colonel Myers. And in this confidential, at the time, declassified memo, it states that during June of 52, there was 100 fighter major accidents, and there was 36 aircraft destroyed, which resulted in 21 men being killed. July, which was the height of the UFO flap over Washington, there was 135 major accidents, 58 aircraft interceptors were destroyed, and there was 30 fatalities. So now when you add up just those 2 months, Whitley, you'll have 235 major accidents of fighter interceptors. 94 were destroyed, and 51 fighter pilots were killed.
Well, you know, we have come to the end of our time together, Frank, and I think you will join me in dedicating this program to the memory of those men and all others who suffered from this world and from others.
Absolutely.
In the UFO wars of the early 50s. Frank Ficino's website is flatwoodsmonster.com. his new book, Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952. You have been listening to one of the great researchers in the UFO field, and frankly, it was an incredible and inspiring experience. Thank you so much for being with us, Frank Ficino.
Thanks for having me on, Whitley.
And now it's time to go to the weird but factual world of Linda Moulton Howe. Only we're not going that far out today because we don't need to. The strangeness is happening this time right here at home, and it's scary. It has to do with the bees, and they're dying back, and that is really frightening. What's even more frightening is why it is happening and what we aren't doing about it. Then we're racing up to the Arctic, where Linda has got some information that will chill you, or rather heat you up, because it is about, well, listen up and find out. Here's our Emmy Award-winning science reporter, EarthFiles.com's Linda Moulton Howe from Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Thank you, Whitley. For 2 years, honeybees have been dying and disappearing in massive numbers throughout North America, Europe, and spreading to other parts of the world. Half of Italy's bee population died in 2007, and by September 2008, the Italian government has issued a ban on 4 nicotine-based pesticides linked to honeybee deaths, including clothianidin and imidacloprid. Argentina has lost more than 30% of its bees, and the British Beekeepers Association reports that 1/3 of English honeybee hives did not survive through this past spring into the summer, and the association says if colony collapse disorder continues, quote, honeybees will disappear completely from Britain by 2018, causing calamitous economic and environmental problems, unquote. French beekeepers linked massive die-offs of their bees with the nicotine-based imidacloprid made by Bayer Crop Science of Germany. In 2003, French farmers rioted and demanded the government ban the pesticide to save their bees. And France did ban imidacloprid, also known as gaucho, from use on sunflowers and sweet corn. European researchers also found in lab research that imidacloprid interferes with bee memory, so the insects can't find their way back to their hives. But while France was banning imidacloprid in 2003, that same year in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency approved, with a conditional registration, yet another nicotine-based pesticide manufactured by Bayer called clothianidin, and also known as poncho. Conditional meant that EPA had some concerns about the nicotine-based pesticide's effect on honeybees. But EPA let Bayer put that pesticide on the American market anyway, while EPA said that it would gather more research data. Last month, on August 13, 2008, German beekeepers and a consumer advocate group filed a legal complaint against Bayer Crop Science to determine how much Bayer really knows about the lethal impact that nicotine-based clothianidin has on honeybees. Clothianidin and related nicotine-based pesticides generate about $1 billion of Bayer's $8.6 billion in global sales. The coalition's attorney said, quote, we suspect that Bayer submitted flawed studies to play down the risks of nicotine-based pesticide residues in treated crops, unquote. Nicotine-based pesticides were also what American beekeepers were worried about in the fall of 2006 when their bees began disappearing in massive numbers. That's when the University of Pennsylvania contacted the Environmental Protection Agency to get the EPA's original data about Bayer's clothianidin. EPA did not release any follow-up data. And finally, the Natural Resources Defense Council filed a Freedom of Information Act request. But EPA still has not replied with the clothianidin data. On Monday, August 18, 2008, NRDC went to court and filed a lawsuit to, quote, uncover critical information that the U.S. government is withholding about the risks posed by nicotine-based pesticides to honeybees. EPA should be evaluating the risks to bees before approving new pesticides, but now refuses to tell the public what it knows. Pesticide restrictions might be at the heart of the solution to this growing honeybee crisis. So why hide the information that EPA should be using to make those decisions, unquote. Recently, I talked with Aaron Colangelo, senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C., who filed the lawsuit against EPA. I asked him about EPA's pesticide approval process.
They really have left a lot of old, bad, toxic chemicals on the market way too long and reapproved them despite overwhelming evidence of human health risks. And now we're seeing with a lot of these newer pesticides, like imidacloprid or like clothianidin, which NRDC just sued over, EPA's hastily approving these new pesticides and not reacting quickly to evidence of environmental harm, like harm to bees. But part of the problem is that EPA's whole conditional approval process to begin with, and thinking about it, what that means is they've said, we're worried about this pesticide for one reason or another. In this case, one of the reasons was harm to bees. So they said, there's reason for concern here about harm to bees, but we're going to approve it anyway while we ask Bayer to conduct additional studies, and we'll leave it on the market while we wait for those studies to come in. And the reason NRDC sued is that 5 years later, there was no public information. We couldn't find out from the EPA website or anywhere else whether those studies had been conducted and submitted to EPA, and if so, what they showed. Did they actually show safety, or did they raise more concerns? And we still don't have a clear answer to that. EPA and Bayer have both said since we sued that the studies have been submitted and that they show safety, but we haven't seen the actual studies themselves. So we still think that there's no way for the public to evaluate the information about harm that this pesticide causes to bees. But there does seem to be a growing scientific consensus that pesticides are implicated, that they may be contributing in some way, and that's what we're trying to find out. The researchers at Penn State have identified, I think, dozens of different pesticides that they find in pollen and in beehives. So we know that there's just tons of exposure. And also, EPA is approving pesticides that are known to be highly toxic to bees. And this exposure may be interacting with other environmental factors or with a virus or something and working in combination to play a role in colony collapse disorder.
Yes, and it is the synergy of so many chemicals out there now in the landscape, overlaying with each other. And on that very point, Jerry Hayes in the Florida Department of Agriculture contacted me this week to send me a copy of the new warning label from Bayer Crop Science on a brand new pesticide called Movento. It says, quote, "This product is potentially toxic to honeybee larvae through residues in pollen and nectar, but not to adult honeybees. Exposure of adult bees to direct treatment or residues on blooming crops can lead to effects on honeybee larvae."
And one problem with that kind of label and the label language you just read is that the industry almost uses it as kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, that if enough warnings are on the label, then we can be exonerated from any harm that's caused. And another problem with that is these labels are pages and pages long, and they may have detailed instructions about what time of year and what wind speed and what nozzle size on your sprayer is or is not appropriate depending on which crop and when they're blooming, and to expect every applicator, every farmer who's using that pesticide to read the fine print for pages and pages and then comply with it in every case is just asking too much. The EPA really needs to develop a comprehensive strategy for protecting honeybees and look at all of the different pesticides that are already on the market that are known to be highly toxic to bees. Sometimes in combination, they're many times more toxic than either one of them would be individually or than you would predict they would be if you thought you could just add them up. So sometimes with different pesticides combined into the same product, 1 plus 1 equals 1,000. The combined product is 1,000 times or more toxic than each of the individual pesticides, and that's something that EPA doesn't evaluate when they approve new pesticides for use.
Yes, how do we put all of this chemical soup back into the bottle?
Well, that we can't do. Unfortunately, there's a lot of toxicity, toxic residues to these chemicals out there that are just going to have to, unfortunately, degrade over time, and that may be over a long time.
This summer of 2008, Bayer received EPA approval to sell yet another pesticide called Movento. This is a new class of insecticide that works as a lipid biosynthesis inhibitor, which interferes with nerve transmissions. That means honeybees and other pollinators will be trying to survive in crops contaminated by not only nicotine-based pesticides, but also by this new systemic Movento, which says right on its 13-page warning label that it kills honeybee larvae either directly upon contact or indirectly from exposure to pollen and nectar brought back to the hives, ironically, by adult bees that are contaminated by Movento. Recently, I have talked with some apiary people in the United States who cannot understand why EPA would approve another bee-killing pesticide without involving the beekeeping world in the decision. Beekeeper representatives are trying to get an official meeting with the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Pesticide Programs, but no firm date and time has been agreed, and they were never involved with any of these pesticide decisions. It has scared Jerry Hayes in the Department of Agriculture Apiary Division in Florida so much that he and others feel now that they have to draw a line in the sand, and they have to say to the Environmental Protection Agency and Bayer Crop Service, we in the beekeeping world, we have to be involved in the approvals of these pesticides that are toxic to honeybee larvae and or adult honeybees. Well, I wanted to interview an EPA authority about the conditional clocyanidin approval and this new Movento pesticide that scares American beekeepers so much. On Wednesday, September 24th, I contacted Dale Kemery, and he is in the EPA Washington, D.C. press office, and his background is pesticides. Mr. Kemery, I was told, had an extensive knowledge and would be able to answer all of my questions about clocyanidin and Movento. When I got him on the phone, I explained that I was a radio reporter and would like to talk with him on the record in a recorded interview about clocyanidin and the new EPA-approved insecticide Movento. He said with some hostility that I could not record him, so I wrote notes. And my question, the first one that I wrote down was, could you confirm the date that EPA approved the Bayer pesticide Movento for sale in the United States this year? There was a long pause, and then he said, hostilely, quote, I have no knowledge about approval of Movento, unquote. I explained that Jerry Hayes, the chief of the apiary section in Florida's Department of Agriculture, had information that Movento had been approved sometime in June of 2008. He said that he would check into the matter and would email me information. I said, Mr. Kemery, I need to talk with you by phone in an interview on the record for radio. With even more hostility, he said, I won't be interviewed. I then asked, who was the director of the EPA Office of Pesticide Programs? With even greater anger, he said, why do you want to know that, unquote. I said, because if you're not going to do an interview, I want to try to speak with a person responsible for pesticide approvals at EPA. In even louder anger, Mr. Kemery said, quote, I don't know if he or anyone will talk with you in an interview, unquote. I said I needed to talk with someone on the record, that this was the EPA was a federal agency. It was paid for by taxpayer dollars. We had this serious colony collapse disorder problem. Nicotine-based pesticides are possibly involved. A lot of scientists think they could be the major reason that Movento is now a new bee-killing pesticide, and I simply wanted to try to report the facts that would include EPA's side about why they approved clothianidin and now the new Movento that he said he knew nothing about. I also told him that I could wait until noon on September 25th for any further information, but after that I would have to edit and do my report. And to date and time as we are speaking on Dreamland, I have not received any other contact back from the Environmental Protection Agency, and I had talked with at least half a dozen people about my goal to simply present EPA and their position on the approval of these honeybee-threatening pesticides. I also called Bayer Crop Science and talked with Dave Fisher in ecotoxicology about Movento. He confirmed that the Environmental Protection Agency approved Movento in June 2008 for sale in the United States, and you can see it advertised as an insecticide at the Bayer Crop Science website. He said that he could not talk with me either on the record in phone recording, but I hope to have more facts to report in the future about Movento, the EPA, and beekeeper efforts to have their voices added to the pesticide approval process. On the afternoon of September 25th, 2008, I learned from Jerry Hayes at the Department of Agriculture in Florida that there may be a meeting in Washington as early as the second week of October 2008. If it comes to pass, it will be the first in which the beekeepers sit down with the Environmental Protection Agency to talk about why they are approving honeybee-killing pesticides. While honeybees and other pollinators are trying to escape extinction in a world overwhelmed by pesticides, mites, viruses, genetically modified crops, and a host of other environmental assaults, all Earth life is facing the survival challenge of a rapidly warming planet. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, said current computer models project that the carbon dioxide blanket around Earth will keep getting thicker unless humans curtail industrial CO2 emissions. The IPCC projects there will be almost a doubling of atmospheric CO2 over the next 90 years, from 383 parts per million volume now to at least 766 parts per million volume. The IPCC also has revised upward its estimates of possible average mean global temperature increases over the rest of this century. It could be as much as 11 degrees Fahrenheit warmer at the end of the 21st century. Compare that to only a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase over the entire 20th century. And now comes a report from a Swedish science team at Stockholm University who say that they sailed in a research ship along the entire Russian northern coast where their underwater instruments measured concentrations of methane gas bubbling up at levels 100 times greater than background methane levels. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is about 25 times more warming than CO2 in a pound-for-pound comparison. That means increased atmospheric methane could heat Earth even faster. One of the leaders of the Swedish expedition, Dr. Orhan Gustafsson, told reporters, quote, "In September 2008, for the first time, we documented in the field where the release was so intense that the methane did not have time to dissolve into the seawater, but was rising as methane bubbles to the sea surface," unquote. Many scientists that I have interviewed over the past 5 years have been very concerned that if Arctic permafrost melt causes a rapid increase in methane release to the atmosphere, the global warming computer models that everyone has been using will be considerably outdated. In other words, a rapid increase of more heat-trapping methane could mean Earth will warm up even faster and possibly higher than the 11 degrees Fahrenheit currently projected by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But one of the most respected atmospheric methane scientists in the United States is not convinced that the Swedish data means a new methane release. He is Ed Dugokensky, Ph.D. and atmospheric chemist at NOAA's Earth System Research Lab in Boulder, Colorado. He works with the NOAA team to monitor 50 methane measuring sites around the Earth to look specifically for changes in methane emissions. This week, I asked Dr. Dugokensky what the implications are if the Swedish team has found a new and strong methane gas release bubbling up in the Arctic waters.
If it's a new mechanism of release in the Arctic, then this would have implications for climate, not just in the Arctic, but globally. Could be the first signs of a strong positive climate feedback in the Arctic. But I guess I'm not convinced that this is new. These types of methane chimneys have been observed in the ocean in other places before.
But this could be a region of the Arctic that you and NOAA have not visited, and it might be brand new?
Well, we would see this signal in the Arctic from our existing measurement sites. We have about half a dozen measurement sites in the Arctic. And if it's of a large enough scale, then we'll be able to capture this signal with our measurements in the Arctic. And I can tell you in 2007, which was quite a warm and also wet year in the Arctic and in the tropics, we did see an increase in methane of about 7.5 parts per billion after a period of 9 years of almost no increase in methane. And it's pretty clear from our measurements that this increase was driven by increased emissions in the Arctic and in the tropics.
The work by the Swedish team might be a 2008 measurement that goes beyond where you were measuring in 2007?
I think the Swedish measurements are different. They're actually measuring methane in the water column, and we're measuring it well downwind of where that methane can potentially bubble out of the ocean into the atmosphere, and then we're just measuring it in the atmosphere. The increase that we observed in 2007 isn't necessarily coming from the ocean. It could be coming from existing wetlands. Emissions of methane from wetlands are very dependent on temperature, with larger emissions typically at higher temperatures. And last year being very warm could have meant higher emissions from existing wetlands in the Arctic. I'm not saying I can rule out these emissions from the ocean. They may be contributing to what we saw in 2007, but our measurement network isn't dense enough to verify that.
Could you explain why it is that methane is so potentially dangerous at a time when we're all concerned about global warming?
The biggest thing is its factor of 25 times more effective than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. And the Arctic contains a huge amount of carbon in permafrost and in hydrates. Releasing either of these reservoirs to the atmosphere could provide a very strong positive feedback on climate.
The positive feedback is that will cause more melting and more release of methane?
That's correct.
With more methane in the current CO2 blanket around the Earth, what is the worst case from your perspective?
The worst case? That's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, let me ask it this way. What might the factors be that could produce a sudden release of methane from the Arctic?
To be honest, I'm not really that concerned about a very sudden release of methane from the Arctic. I think these are changes that are going to happen slowly over time scales of centuries or longer. Like, for example, the warming is going to increase emissions from wetlands. Just because of the increased temperature and permafrost melts, you're going to create new wetlands that's going to create new sources of methane. With methane hydrates, as the Arctic Ocean warms, perhaps these hydrates will become unstable and they'll add to the chronic background emissions of methane to the atmosphere. What I'm expecting to see in the Arctic as permafrost melts, as some of these hydrate sources kick in, would be for that Arctic portion of those emissions to just increase gradually over time.
If instead of a gradual increase over time, there was an explosive release of methane from the Arctic, what would the consequences be to our planet?
Warming, probably fairly rapid. This would have to be a very, very large pulse of methane to have such a big impact on climate in a short time, because the change in methane from pre-industrial times to now is about 1,000 ppb. That's a very, very large amount of methane, and I can't envision a mechanism where within a few years an equal amount of methane can suddenly be released to the atmosphere. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just a very low probability.
So melting at the rate that the Arctic is melting now could not produce a sudden explosion of methane gas.
It would be unlikely.
And Florida State University released on September 24th one of their new climate studies that shows more than 7,900 acres of South Florida could be underwater by the year 2030 as sea levels rise, inundating coastal areas and causing billions of dollars in property loss. It's all happening so quickly, Whitley.
Well, I know it, Linda. It's happening much too quickly. And, you know, he said that about the Arctic methane not outgassing, not causing a sudden change. But, you know, with all of the carbon dioxide in the air already, I think that he is trying to protect himself rather than tell the truth here.
Let me explain one thing that he said. Because they have these 50 monitoring sites, and they have been doing this both on the ground and from satellites, and they are measuring air, and the Swedes have been measuring the methane in the water columns itself. So there are two different formats here. That they have assumed, NOAA has assumed up till now, that they would be very well aware of any bubbling increase from the water if it was above what they have been measuring for some time, and they did have this spike in 2007. So right now, he, in fact, is going to get together with the Swedish scientists at a meeting that will be held in about 3 weeks, and that they are going to discuss exactly this data. They're going to try to discern whether or not this is new, and I'm scheduled to do another interview with him in December as an update on where they stand.
It's terribly important because we've come to understand what happened back in the Younger Dryas 11,000 years ago, and the climate change that it went from hot like this or hotter to suddenly very cold because of the fact that methane had been outgassing. It stopped. Methane is a short-lived gas. And when the methane outgassing stopped, the climate just snapped. Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for being with us as always.
Flap,
which is a very specific term, as I recall from reading your book.
Right.
What they mean by a flap.
A flap is actually, I'm going to give you a quote, Whitley, for the record. This is an Air Force explanation right out of their dictionary. A flap is a condition, a situation, or a state of being of a group of persons characterized by an advanced degree of confusion that has not quite reached panic proportions. So the country was at the boiling point back then, and during the summer of '52, with the frenzy of saucer sightings that was going on.
Which means that they were they were considering this quite seriously then.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
This is, you have to remember, too, back in this era, Whitley, intelligence had figured out that the Russians had the capability of dropping atomic bombs on this country. So the Air Force was spring-loaded. They were ready to go, and they were chasing anything and everything that was seen in the skies or picked up on radar.
Now, what kind of orders were they under in 1952? And I'm referring, of course, to this International News Service story. Right.
It was released back in July.
July 29th.
July 29th. The INS report that fighter interceptor planes of the United States had been placed on a 24-hour nationwide alert against flying saucers. And an Air Force public information officer, Montel Monti, had stated, and I'm going to give a quote here for the record, the jet pilots are and have been under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down.
Which is the shadow. Whitley Strieber, a few years ago, to be exact, on February the 4th, 2005, I had a remarkable guest on Dreamland, Frank Ficino. Frank was the author of the Braxton County case. I think the book was called The Flatwoods Monster, and it had to have been one of the most extraordinary shows we ever did about UFOs. The book was phenomenally well researched, and I am very happy to say that Frank is back with us with one of the very finest UFO books I have ever read. The research in this book is remarkably skillful and thorough. The book has a foreword by Stanton Friedman and an afterword by Stanton Friedman, and I will be talking to Stanton Friedman in the subscriber section, where we're going to go and look at an even larger canvas from 1947 to 1954, and for those of you who are subscribers, do not miss that, because it's going to be phenomenal. What's also going to be phenomenal right now is talking to Frank Ficino about his new book, Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952. And let me tell you, hold on to your hats, because what you have not been told about what happened in this country and in this world in 1952 is phenomenal. Just phenomenal. Welcome to the show, Frank Ficino.
Thanks for having me on, Whitley.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Now, Frank, let's go back a little bit to this era of the early 50s. And why don't you begin by telling us what drew you to research this era in the first place?
Well, Whitley, back in the early 90s, I was
of the reality of that is all that's left. But what Frank has done is he's filled out that shadow with his research, and now we know we have a remarkable and powerful picture of what happened back in those days. Now, let's talk a little bit now about this telegram from Robert Farnsworth, President of the U.S. Rocket Society, to President Truman, who was then President of the United States, if I'm not correct, in 1952.
Correct.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Farnsworth was actually dead against this whole quote of information about shooting down flying saucers, and he actually had sent a letter to Harry Truman and all the heads of the armed forces, and he says this could be of the gravest consequences if we were to shoot down something of superior intelligence.
Well, yeah, you would think so.
Right.
You don't want to make the guy with the better bazooka mad.
Right. But what we have, I did a little bit of research, Whitley. Now, I want to explain, I didn't do this whole project on myself. I'm an illustrator and author, but I had a heck of a team behind me. I worked with Korean War vets, World War II vets, Vietnam vets, fighter pilots, mechanics. So I have a team behind me that I worked with to better understand the military end. It's not just UFOs. I had to study the military aspect of what was going on. And that's what I think was lacking in the UFO field for so many years. Everybody was looking at the flying saucers over here, but nobody was visiting some relatives in West Virginia in Braxton County, and I stumbled across this Flatwoods monster case. I was going into this little town called Flatwoods, and it said on the side of the road on this big wooden sign, "Welcome to Flatwoods, home of the Green Monster." And I didn't have any previous UFO involvement. I had known, a little bit about it from what was in magazines and the press, but I looked into this case. I was on the fence down the middle. I didn't know what to make of it, so I started researching it on my own time. And what intrigued me about the case is when I started speaking to the people in Flatwoods, it was more interesting seeing the response about this Flatwoods monster from this local citizens than the actual case itself. The town was very scared. Not too many people talked about this particular case. And as I'm now in my 17th year of research with this Flatwoods case and the Shoot Them Down book that just came out recently. And the Flatwoods case was very interesting because when it happened back on September 12th in 52, the public was told pretty much overnight what had occurred. It was this 12-foot-tall creature that landed in a damaged aircraft in central West Virginia.
Which people initially mistook for a giant owl.
Right. Well, that was the government's official explanation.
It was a 6-foot-tall owl.
Yeah, a giant owl, which is, that's what it's basically.
The giant owl. In many ways, that's as interesting as if it had been an alien.
Right. So I started researching the Flatwoods incident. Then I started doing an overall look into what was going on during the summer of 1952.
And you have, in your career, have produced some of the best research, UFO research, ever done. I mean, you're right up there. You and Richard Dolan are neck and neck, in my opinion.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, what I found out, Whitley, is during 1952 was the record year for UFO reports sent to Project Blue Book. And there was 1,501 reports sent to Blue Book, and actually 303 were unknowns. So the summer of 52, which the Shoot Them Down book encompasses, June, July, August, and September of that year, there was 1,134 reports sent to Blue Book.
Right. And at this time, Blue Book was did not turn into what it later became. It was still just a fact-gathering and maybe something more effort by the Air Force.
Right, and Edward Ruppelt, Captain Ruppelt, was in charge of Blue Book at that time. And also that year we have the Washington sightings, June, July, and then into August.
And July. We'll get into those later.
Right, so there was a lot going on that year.
So tell us a little bit about Captain Ruppelt and his operation as it existed at the time. It was, of course, headquartered at Wright-Patterson, as we would expect it to be.
Right.
What was it under? Where was he in the bureaucracy of the area?
Well, he was the head of the ATIC at Wright-Pat. He headed up the department for Project Blue Book.
What does ATIC mean?
Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And Ruppelt actually, in his book, the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, he actually stated that in early June of 52, the Air Force was unknowingly in the initial stages of a flap, the flying saucer